Welcome back. Last time we finished the encounter of Jesus with the Jews during the Feast of Tabernacles, concentrating on the last day of the feast, which is also known as the greatest day. We saw that the increasingly volatile argument between Jesus and the Jews could be divided into three segments. The first concerned the validity of Jesus' witness, the second looked at the validity of the Jews' judgment, and the third, the climax, again brought to the fore Jesus' identity, which we discovered is an increasingly thorny topic with the Jews. Our current session begins with the section which many interpreters see as an interlude placed in the middle of the Tabernacles narrative between chapters 7 and 8 of the Gospel text, namely the story of the woman caught in adultery. This is a text which is unique to John. Following that discussion, we'll look at what many call the aftermath of Tabernacles, which consists of the story of the cure of a blind man, which is all of chapter 9, and the discourse on the Good Shepherd in the beginning of chapter 10. Because of the length of the blind man narrative, it will be necessary to cover it in two sessions. The Good Shepherd, then, will be the topic of the session following those. The narrative of the cure of the blind man has been divided into seven subsections or scenes by scholars. In this session, we'll look at the first four of those scenes. Scene 1 is a discussion of Jesus with the disciples, discussing the relationship of sin and sickness. Scene 2 is the actual cure of the blind man. Scene 3 is a discussion among the neighbors as to whether the man who now sees was actually the man who was blind. And that discussion leads to scene 4, where the cured man is haled before the Sanhedrin. If one reads the narrative of chapters 7 and 8 of John's Gospel, it's clear that the narrative of the woman taken in adultery is an interruption, John 7:53 to 8:12, an intrusion, as Maloney puts it. It's omitted by many of the major manuscripts of the New Testament, or it's placed in a different place. Perkins suggests that it's placed here to illustrate Jesus' statement to the Jews on judgment found at 8:15, just following the narrative. So, in any case, it's clear that the text was considered as canonical, even though several feel it doesn't belong where it's at. The crowd and the Jews depart their homes, while Jesus goes to the Mount of Olives, where, according to Luke's tradition, he went to pray. Then, the next morning, Jesus returns to the temple precincts, where a crowd, described as all the people, surrounds him, and he begins to teach them. Jesus' teaching is interrupted, however, by the scribes and the Pharisees, who lead a woman in who had been caught, that is, surprised, in the act of adultery, which is clearly a violation of the Mosaic law. Now, a number of questions immediately arise. Adultery takes two. Where's the other party? She was caught. Were they spying on her? How did they catch her in the act, so to speak? They put the woman in the middle of the group where Jesus is teaching, announcing that she was caught in the act of adultery. Noting then that in the law of Moses, it was commanded that such a one be stoned. Numbers 5:12, Leviticus 20:10, Deuteronomy 22:22 to 24. They then put their question. Therefore, what do you say? Note that the woman plays no major part at this point. She's merely the catalyst that brings about the Pharisees' question. In typical style, as we've come to expect, the Johannine editor adds his comment, here noting the true motivation for this little intervention. They said this, testing him, in order that they might have an accusation against him. If he didn't agree with them, they would be able to show that he was not interested in enforcing the law. Jesus' response is seemingly to ignore their question. He bends down and traces with his finger in the earth or the dirt. The word for write here is not the usual word that's used for writing, which is grapho. Rather, the author chooses to use the word katagrapho, which has the connotation of to trace or to draw. Hence, Jesus may not be writing, but rather doodling on the ground so as to kill a bit of time and heighten the tension. Nevertheless, much ink has been spent on what it was that he wrote. As he does this, the accusers continually seek his response. With time having passed, he straightens up, gives them his answer, which is not the answer that they expected. Let him who is without sin cast the first stone. This statement forces the accusers to look at themselves rather than this woman. The law specified that the ones who were witnesses to the acts were to cast the stones first, then all the others. Again, heightening the tension, Jesus bends down to trace or doodle again, passing time. Realizing that they are culpable before God and have violated God's law, maybe not regarding adultery, but obedience, false witnessing, stealing, etc., the Jews depart one by one, beginning with the eldest. Eventually, Jesus was left alone with the woman. And so Jesus asks the obvious question, where are they? Has no one condemned you? And the woman responds, no one, Lord. Jesus, acting as he has with others in the gospel, for example, the Samaritan woman, does not condemn her either. That response is all the more consoling, seeing that of all the people in that scene who could have cast the first stone according to Jesus' criteria, he was the only one who was eligible. But he chose not to be judge, but Savior. It's clear that he does not condone what she's been doing, and so he admonishes her, go and sin no more. As with the Samaritan woman, he accepts her where she is. He does not lecture her, but allows her to experience that acceptance, which will lead her to accept and follow him, changing her life and sinning no more. Once again, a good lesson for all of us. Now we move to the aftermath of tabernacles. It is so called because there is no mention of a change of time. In this unit, a blind man is introduced. And as we said above, this narrative is a short novel of sorts, consisting of 7 acts or scenes. The narrative opens with Jesus and his disciples encountering a blind man, which sparks a question from the disciples concerning the relationship of sinfulness to the man's situation. The narrative begins simply with the participle passing by. As he was passing by, Jesus sees a man who was blind from birth. The location seems to be south of the temple area, near one of the 2 southern gates to the city of Jerusalem, the Zion Gate, but more probably the Dung Gate. The man is described as blind from birth. In other words, He's never had sight. As such, he was totally dependent on others. This prompts the disciples to question Jesus. Rabbi, who sinned, this one or his parents, in order that he was born blind? It should be clear that this man could not have sinned in the womb. So it must be some sin of the parents or ancestors being visited upon this man. The rabbis believed that there was a direct cause and effect relation between sin and suffering. Quote, I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, bringing punishment for their parents' wickedness on the children of those who hate me, down to the third and the fourth generation. Deuteronomy 5:9. Here is a map of the city of Jerusalem as it was in AD 70, just before it was destroyed by the Romans. But the general layout of the city had changed little since the time of Christ. Toward the center on the right, you can see the temple. The gates that are referenced are just below the southern wall of the temple platform and gain entrance into that platform. Jesus' response is to negate the thought of the disciples and the general thought of the people, for that matter. Neither this one nor his parents sinned. It was that the works of God may be made manifest in him. It's not that sin is involved at all. Rather, this man becomes a vehicle through which the magnificent work of God may be demonstrated. It's similar to Exodus 19:6, where God tells Pharaoh, "This is why I have spared you, to show you my power, so that my name may be declared through all the earth." Jesus stands closer to Job than to the traditional Deuteronomic thought here. Jesus now continues the light-darkness theme, which has been prominent in the gospel thus far, especially in the Tabernacles episode, and joins it to the notion of doing God's work. It's necessary for us to work the works of the one who sent me while it is still day. The use of the one who sent me recalls the notion of Jesus as God's agent. The verb day, it is necessary, implies that the work of God must be accomplished by Jesus no matter what opposition may crop up. He continues, "Night is coming, when no one is able to work." This particular reference to day and night has a further dimension. The day of Jesus' ministry is coming to an end. The night is rapidly approaching, when Jesus will fall to the powers of darkness and no longer be able to work. Jesus makes that perfectly clear. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. This is the very statement he made at Tabernacles in John 8:12. But he will not be in the world much longer. Implied is the fact that even the light of the world is unable to work at night. Then Jesus acts, allowing the blind man to gain his sight. Imagine what a wondrous experience it must have been for this man, who had not experienced sight at all, to see the wonderful world around him. Linking to the discussion with the disciples through yet another participle, having said these things, the main action of the narrative takes place. It's described as he spat on the ground, and he made clay from the spittle. This is very similar to the narratives in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, of the cures of blind men. It was believed that human saliva had curative properties. Many of the stories of Jewish miracle workers use saliva to cure. It also bears similarities to God's action in creation of the first human being in Genesis 2:7. Then Jesus smeared the clay on the eyes of the blind man. This is quite different from the other signs in the gospel. Yet the way it is narrated, it heightens the tension. Then Jesus commands the man, "Go and wash in the pool of Siloam," which is interpreted as sent. Now the pool of Siloam was to the far south of the temple. It was the pool from which the water was drawn for the tabernacle's water ceremonies, it will be recalled. But for our purposes, it's more interesting to note that at the time of the Assyrian invasion, during the reign of King Hezekiah, in order to further fortify the city, he had a great tunnel dug from the Gihon spring in the Kidron Valley to the pool of Siloam. In other words, via this tunnel, water was sent from the outside of the city in Gihon into the city at Siloam. Then the confirmation of the miraculous sign. Therefore, he went, obeying Jesus' first command. He washed, obeying Jesus' second command, and he came back seeing, the result of that obedience. Here we have a picture of the pool of Siloam as it is depicted in the model of the city of Jerusalem in AD 66. You can see it's at the southernmost edge of what is known as the city of David. This is a view of the pool looking down from the city, from the upper city, actually. And finally, this is the pool as it looks today. This is the Siloam end of the famous tunnel of Hezekiah mentioned above. It's still possible to traverse the tunnel when the water levels are low enough. The miracle completed, attention now turns to the reactions, and the first reaction comes from the very people associated with this man on a daily basis, his neighbors, and those who had generally seen him as part of their daily routine. The connection to the miracle account is made through the particle un, translated therefore. Then the neighbors are introduced. They are generally people of the same neighborhood or community. They're further described as those who saw him earlier, during that time when he was a beggar. Note, the only way that a blind person could support themselves was through begging. Hence, many of the blind were also beggars. They question immediately whether or not he is the beggar. They're so used to seeing. Is this not the one who would sit and beg? The use of the particle uk signals that they are expecting the answer yes. When the question is posed, a division of opinion emerges among these neighbors. Some say that indeed he is the familiar blind beggar, while others are not so certain. It could be someone who looks like him. But the now healed man, overhearing their discussion, puts an end to their debate, saying simply, "I'm the one." The verb tense used for all of the verbs of saying is imperfect, which implies that this is not just a simple question and answer. They're continually questioning, and he's continually affirming his identity. Thus, what this introduction of the neighbors does narratively is establish that the man standing before them seeing clearly is the blind man who sat and begged. As a consequence, signified again by the particle un or therefore, they ask the logical question: how then were your eyes opened? The healed man replies in what would become the first of many retellings of the story of his healing. The man whom they called Jesus made clay, smeared it in my eyes, and said to me, "Go to Siloam and wash." So he basically recounts what Jesus had done and said almost verbatim. Therefore, having gone and washed, I came back seeing. Notice the same three verbs that signified the miracle originally. The scene ends with the neighbors questioning the healed man about the whereabouts of this Jesus. At this point, we're not sure of the motives of the neighbors or their concern for Jesus' whereabouts. The healed man answers simply and honestly that he does not know. This leads to the fourth scene, which brings the whole incident to the attention of the authorities. The healed man has his first encounter with the Pharisees. The scene begins with the simple verb they, namely the neighbors, lead. The implication is that the neighbors are the subject. The object is the former blind man. So the neighbors lead the blind man, the former blind man, to the Pharisees. Now, Beasley Murray sees this as simply a chance for the religious leaders to be informed of a wondrous event that has taken place. There seemingly is no hostile intent in their action. But given the movement of the gospel thus far, when the Pharisees are involved, there usually is some level of hostility. That fact is supported by a comment that the editor inserts into the narrative. He says, "Now it was the Sabbath day on which Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes." This basically sets up the remainder of the narrative. We can see a parallel here between the third sign at the pool of Bethzatha and this sixth sign. Scholars have seen that since it was the Sabbath, Jesus violated the Sabbath law in three ways. First, the man's blindness was not a life and death situation. It could have waited until the Sabbath ended. Second, Jesus kneaded the clay with the saliva to make the salve. Kneading is prohibited on the Sabbath. And finally, he anointed the man's eyes with the salve, which later Jewish tradition specifically prohibited on the Sabbath. So the Pharisees need to get at the facts in order to see that justice is done, if indeed the Sabbath was violated. It should be noted that the great work that has been done for the blind man becomes almost irrelevant here. It could have been done at another time, and thus the Sabbath would have been preserved. The informing of the Pharisees takes the form of an interrogation of the now healed man. The Pharisees also ask the question concerning how he received his sight, leading to the second telling of the story, which also may explain the unusual adverb again, since this is the first time he told the authorities about his experience. The other telling was to the neighbors. The healed man, again, speaks using the three verbs that are becoming fairly common in this narrative. He put clay on my eyes, I washed, and I see. Note that the action of Jesus narrated as an anointing of the eyes with clay. The washing and the seeing are seemingly the decision of the blind man. Not quite the way it happened. Is he trying to remove some of the responsibility from Jesus? Just as with the neighbors, so also with the authorities, there is disagreement. Some of the Pharisees claim that this Jesus cannot be from God, since he does not keep the Sabbath, while others are impressed with the sign itself and wonder how one who is not with God can do such a sign. The editor ends noting that there was a division, a schism among them. Andreas Kostenberger sees this division falling along the lines of the two prominent schools of the day, Shammai and Hillel. The proponents of Shammai would say that whoever breaks a law is a sinner, and thus is not from God. The proponents of the school of Hillel would concentrate on the good works, and see that he must be from God, since he has performed such a good work. So the focus returns to the healed man. What do you say concerning him because he opened your eyes? They are, in Brandt's opinion, challenging the man to evaluate what has happened to him and denounce the man Jesus. That he is unwilling to do. Rather, in similar reasoning as the Samaritan woman, he says he is a prophet. That isn't the answer they wanted, but it does show that the man not only sees in the natural realm, but he's also gaining insight on the supernatural realm. He's beginning to see further into who this Jesus might actually be. Well, that's about all we have time for in this session. Next time, we'll finish the narrative of the cure of the man born blind and show how it forms a paradigm for the movement of the entire gospel. See you then.